What if the crown jewels aren't the most valuable things the royals are hiding? Behind the polished waves, gilded portraits, and carefully curated smiles lies a labyrinth of secrets. Some whispered through palace walls, others buried so deep history itself forgot to blush. Affairs, betrayals, hidden cousins, covert operations, and stories too strange for fiction. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain. This isn't the monarchy you read about in textbooks. This is the monarchy they hoped you'd never notice. These are the 30 most shocking family secrets hidden by the British royals. Before we step any further into the shadows of the palace, quick favor. If stories like these keep you up at night, or make you question everything before breakfast, hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel, and it lets me know you're just as suspicious as I am. Also, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Melbourne? Tea time in Toronto? Let me know in the comments. All right, back to the secrets they swore would never see the light. 1. Anthony Blunt as a Soviet spy. Officially, he was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, a man tasked with cataloging the Crown's vast treasure trove of classical art. Unofficially, he was also cataloging state secrets for the Soviets. Anthony Blunt was a man who knew how to move through corridors, both literal and political, with quiet precision. Born into the upper crust of English society and educated at Cambridge, he checked every box of the trusted establishment figure. He wore tweed. He quoted Poussin. He sipped sherry in rooms where everyone had titles and nobody raised their voice. But underneath all of it, Blunt was a double agent. One of 5, in fact. Part of the now infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring, recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s. His job? Slip into the aristocracy and keep smiling. Blunt's long con wasn't just about spying, it was about placement and patience. He embedded himself within the very sanctum of British royalty, eventually securing a post inside Buckingham Palace. For 17 years, he held the Queen's trust as the official custodian of some of the most priceless art in Europe. What he actually trafficked, though, wasn't brushstrokes or Baroque masterpieces. It was intelligence. Real intelligence. Documents, whispers, maps, and secrets. He passed them on quietly, carefully, diligently, to Moscow. The scandal didn't fully surface until decades later. When it did, it felt less like a bombshell and more like a bureaucratic hiccup. Margaret Thatcher's government formally outed Blunt in 1979. But by then, he'd already confessed years earlier in a closed-door deal that granted him immunity. He wouldn't be tried. He wouldn't be jailed. He wouldn't even be exiled. He kept his title and quietly lived out the rest of his life under academic shielding. A public traitor, still sipping tea in private. It wasn't just the espionage that disturbed people. It was the covering up of the espionage. According to later reports, the royal family had been informed privately of Blunt's betrayal in the late 1960s. The Queen knew. The inner circle knew. But the public? They were told nothing. For years, Blunt was allowed to roam the palace halls, post-confession, continuing to advise on art as if treason were just a mild eccentricity. Here's the twist. He may have kept secrets from the crown, but he also kept secrets for it. Historians have long whispered that part of the reason Blunt's betrayal was so quietly swept under the antique rug was that he held delicate knowledge of royal family entanglements, potentially damaging files he accessed during World War II intelligence work. One of them, allegedly, concerned certain sympathies and associations the former King Edward VIII had with Nazi Germany, a connection we'll revisit later. In other words, Blunt wasn't just a liability, he was also a threat, a very elegant one. What does it say about a system when the man betraying the nation is also the man trusted to preserve its cultural soul? Maybe it says the system isn't built on trust at all, just on the performance of it. And while Anthony Blunt is long dead, the idea of a silent insider, someone who knows too much and speaks too little, lingers. Especially in a family like this one, where silence is not a flaw, but a virtue. Or at least it's supposed to be. But silence has a habit of swelling into secrecy. And sometimes, what's being hidden isn't political betrayal or stolen paintings. Sometimes, it's the body itself. Because when the next royal secret began to leak, it wasn't about treason, it was about the one thing no monarch can escape: decay. 2. Hidden health issues of monarchs and royals. Royalty, by definition, is supposed to look immortal, unblemished, symmetrical, unshaken by the mortal diseases that plague the rest of us. That's the illusion, or rather the job description. For centuries, British monarchs have worn crowns while hiding fevers, limps, and diagnoses behind velvet curtains. It's a family tradition not of health, but of concealment. Consider King George VI, the father of Elizabeth II. To the world, he was the embodiment of quiet fortitude, the reluctant king who found his voice during the war. But what the people didn't know, and weren't supposed to know, was that their sovereign was dying long before the grand processions and patriotic speeches ended. His lung disease was masked by stiff collars and polished speeches. Courtiers edited medical bulletins to sound less fatal. When surgeons removed part of his lung in 1951, the word cancer was never spoken publicly. Newspapers referred to structural issues. He was photographed looking resolute, pale but determined. The British way of dying, neatly folded into duty. He passed away months later, the monarchy never once admitting the truth while he breathed. This royal choreography of concealment wasn't unique to him. It was inherited. Centuries earlier, monarchs from Henry VIII to George III had suffered chronic ailments that were spun into mythology. Henry's injuries and infections were recast as divine punishment or masculine fury. George III's deteriorating mental state was blamed on ill temper, or melancholy, while his court quietly endured the unpredictable outbursts of a man clearly in medical crisis. Even the records of his doctors were sanitized. Royal madness had to be rewritten as eccentricity, and pain had to look like composure. Fast forward to the modern era, and the pattern hasn't changed. Only the lighting has. In the age of social media and round-the-clock news, the royal body remains a state secret disguised as public spectacle. The health of King Charles III became a carefully choreographed narrative of treatment, recovery, and privacy, words that reveal everything and nothing at once. The palace issues bulletins with the precision of a surgeon, every adjective weighed, every omission deliberate. The result is not information, but theater. The same goes for the Princess of Wales, whose recent health challenges were wrapped in mystery, feeding a global guessing game that bordered on hysteria. Photographs were edited, statements rehearsed, and the public was reminded, politely but firmly, that curiosity was inappropriate. The royal family, after all, does not owe the truth. Yet, the secrecy raises a strange paradox. The monarchy relies on the idea that it represents the nation, a living emblem of continuity, strength, and stability. But how can a symbol of national health remain legitimate if it must constantly hide the fact that it too breaks down? The answer lies in the power of the mask. The royal body is not just flesh, it's propaganda. It must be seen as resilient even when it isn't. Because if the monarch coughs, the country panics. If the monarch falters, the myth of permanence wobbles. So they do what monarchs have always done. They turn illness into ritual, vulnerability into mystique, and human frailty into an exercise in stage management. Behind palace walls, however, the illusion exacts a price. The courtiers and doctors who live closest to the crown carry the burden of silence. In leaked diaries and second-hand memoirs, there are whispers of operations done in secrecy, of deathbed vigils where even family members weren't told the truth until the press had gone to print. Royal physicians have long been bound by oaths, not of medicine, but of monarchy. Their first duty is not to the patient's body, but to the institution's image. And this secrecy, ironically, ensures the one thing it fears most: speculation. The less the public knows, the more they imagine. Every edited photo, every evasive statement, becomes an invitation to conspiracy. The monarchy can control the message, but never the meaning. And in the end, the truth, however mundane or tragic, always leaks. It seeps through polished smiles, trembling hands, or the suspicious absence of a familiar face at a balcony appearance. So when historians say that the crown must endure, they rarely mention what's required for that endurance: the quiet burial of sickness. The royal body must appear eternal, even as it decays in secret. That's the paradox of power: to be both mortal and mythic, fragile and untouchable. And yet, while the public is distracted by the question of who's ailing or recovering, another question lurks just beneath it. How much does the monarchy actually cost to keep alive? Financially, not just physically. Because if there's one thing the royal family hides even better than illness, it's money. And while the palace kept that illness under lock and key, just like they did with so many others, let's take a quick breath. If you've made it this far down the royal rabbit hole, chances are you're exactly my kind of curious. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Also, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it on your end? Late night in Lagos? Early morning in Edinburgh? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's listening while the royals sleep. 3. Secret wealth and financial opacity. The British royal family is often described as symbolic, decorative, ceremonial, a national ornament kept on the shelf for patriotic occasions and international headlines. But behind the pomp, pageantry, and polished smiles lies something a little less photogenic. A financial fortress so opaque it makes offshore tax havens look like open books. Here's what most people think they know. The royals are funded by something called the sovereign grant, a tidy little annual allowance drawn from the crown estate's profits. Public money, but technically not taxpayer funded. At least that's the polite fiction. The reality? The sovereign grant is just the tip of a golden iceberg. A tiny visible portion of a structure that includes secretive private estates, undisclosed income streams, and decades of well-lobbied legal loopholes. Let's talk about those estates. The Duchy of Lancaster, the monarch's personal portfolio, brings in tens of millions in revenue every year, entirely separate from state funding. Likewise, the Duchy of Cornwall, historically passed to the Prince of Wales, is worth over £1 billion and operates as a full-blown corporate empire. Farmland, offices, suburban housing, business parks. It's capitalism with a coronet. And while these duchies are not supposed to be private property in the conventional sense, the royal family has historically enjoyed all the perks of ownership, including freedom from paying capital gains tax until very recently. Even now, it's a tax code designed not for fairness, but for flexibility. But the real magic trick is not how the money is made. It's how it disappears. The Queen's will, for example, was sealed after her death in 2022 and will remain secret for at least 90 years. No other British citizen gets that privilege, and she wasn't the first. For over a century, royal wills have been hidden from public scrutiny under the guise of national interest. What kind of national interest? The kind that avoids awkward questions about inheritance, assets, or secret beneficiaries. Imagine that. The most publicly visible family in the country gets to keep their private fortunes exactly that. Private. Then there's the matter of royal property. While Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other estates are technically owned by the Crown, not the monarch personally, the lines between public and private have always been intentionally blurred. The taxpayer foots the bill for renovations, security, and staffing, yet the public doesn't get a key. Transparency is treated not as a duty, but as an existential threat. And when journalists or watchdog groups push for financial disclosure, the royal institution responds with the quiet efficiency of a well-funded bureaucracy: stall, obscure, and remind everyone that royalty is above politics, and by extension, accountability. Of course, defenders argue that the royal family brings in more than it takes, that the tourism revenues, soft power, and national pride justify the cost. But these are the same defenders who never quite explain why other constitutional monarchies manage to operate with a fraction of the expense and infinitely more disclosure. In the Netherlands or Sweden, royal family finances are far more transparent. In Britain, opacity is tradition. Even Parliament has often been left in the dark. Attempts to audit royal spending have been watered down, buried in committees, or quietly abandoned. Requests for clarity on overseas investments or property deals meet with carefully worded refusals. And all the while, public trust is managed not with facts, but with fairy tales. She serves, the headlines say. He sacrifices. Never mind the offshore holdings, the secret trusts, or the centuries of inherited privilege baked directly into the national budget. It raises a morally provocative question. Can an institution that claims to embody national unity also refuse national scrutiny? And if it can, what exactly is being preserved? Tradition, or just unearned comfort? But the secret of money, like the secret of power, is that it's only one part of the puzzle. Because no matter how many fortresses you build, no matter how many ledgers you hide, wealth alone can't protect you from chaos. And the royals know this better than anyone, especially when the threat comes not from the outside world, but from within their own war rooms. Because buried even deeper than the bank vaults are plans. Plans for when the sky falls. Plans that were never supposed to be made public. Until one day, they were. 4. Secret evacuation plans. During wartime, nuclear threat. It was called Operation Candid, a name so generically cheerful it almost sounded like a children's board game. Except it wasn't. It was a Cold War contingency plan. One that detailed exactly how to extract the British royal family from London in the event of a nuclear strike. Not just an escape route, but an entire choreography of survival, quietly rehearsed, strictly confidential, and kept from public knowledge for decades. This wasn't the first time the royals had prepared to flee their people. During World War II, there were whispers of relocating the king and queen, and their children, including a very young Princess Elizabeth, to Canada. The official line at the time was defiant. "The children won't go without me, I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." A fine quote. Stirring, heroic, and largely performative. Because behind the closed doors of Whitehall, escape plans were being drafted, involving trains, ships, and, if needed, total transatlantic relocation. Patriotism was for the press. Contingency was for the monarchy. Fast forward to the Cold War, and the stakes had changed. The threat wasn't Luftwaffe bombs anymore. It was mushroom clouds. Enter Operation Candid, a plan formulated in the 1960s under a growing sense of apocalyptic dread. If nuclear war broke out, the royal family would be whisked away to a series of secure, undisclosed rural estates. One of the options was a converted slate mine in Wales. Another involved a repurposed royal yacht. And then there was the mobile caravan plan, essentially a moving fortress of vehicles, guarded by elite troops, spiraling through the countryside while the rest of the nation sheltered in place. Or didn't. The striking thing about these plans isn't just their complexity. It's their assumption. The assumption that the monarch must be preserved no matter what. That the symbol of national continuity was more vital than actual continuity itself. In essence, while the people ducked and covered, the crown had a getaway car. Some might argue this was necessary, that institutions must survive disasters to rebuild society. But others might ask, if the monarchy's legitimacy comes from being with the people, what does it mean to disappear when things get rough? Even after Operation Candid was eventually declassified, the royal household remained tight-lipped. No formal acknowledgement, no comment, just silence. The institutional reflex that turns every revelation into a footnote. And yet, over time, details have trickled out. Former military personnel recalling training exercises, discarded bunkers with embossed insignias, handwritten documents referencing Her Majesty's mobile shelter, all artifacts of a plan that was never supposed to be needed and never supposed to be found. The irony is that the monarchy relies so heavily on appearing timeless and stable, yet it's quietly built entire strategies for vanishing. A paradox that's somehow both pragmatic and deeply unsettling, because it reveals a truth the crown rarely admits, that its own survival sometimes comes at the cost of visibility, and that in the moment of national crisis, its greatest weapon isn't presence, it's absence. There's something inherently psychological about that. The people are told the royals will never leave, while the blueprints for escape are filed in folders marked top secret. It raises a peculiar moral question. Is it loyalty if you leave quietly? Or is it betrayal with better manners? But the monarchy's relationship with concealment runs far deeper than bunkers and backup yachts, because sometimes what gets hidden isn't strategy. It's suffering, not just among the public, but within the royal bloodline itself. And in the next case, that suffering belonged to a woman who wore a veil not of jewels, but of silence. 5. Hidden disabilities or illnesses of royal family members. Royal visibility has always been a controlled art, not just in terms of who appears where, but how. Which movements are allowed, which expressions are shown, which imperfections must be erased. But what happens when the body itself refuses to cooperate? When a royal is not just human, but visibly, undeniably vulnerable? For Princess Alice of Battenberg, mother of Prince Philip, grandmother to King Charles III, that question wasn't rhetorical. It was personal. Born into European royalty and deaf from birth, Alice's early life was a careful balancing act between expectation and adaptation. She learned to lip-read in multiple languages and was known for her sharp intelligence and spiritual conviction. But despite her resilience, Alice's life would later be rewritten and largely erased through the lens of royal discomfort. In the 1930s, Alice began experiencing symptoms that were described at the time as unusual behavior. In the language of aristocracy, that phrase covered a wide spectrum of what would today be classified as neurological or psychiatric conditions. She spoke often of divine missions, claimed to receive messages from religious figures, and withdrew from social norms. Her family, unsure of how to respond, and deeply conscious of public image, committed her to a psychiatric clinic in Switzerland. There, she was subjected to treatments common at the time, including rest cures and institutional isolation. But here's the uncomfortable part. The royal record barely mentions this chapter. Alice was effectively removed from public life for years, her condition discussed in whispers, her absence explained away as personal retreat. When Prince Philip married Elizabeth, his mother wasn't at the wedding. She wasn't even in the country. No official explanation was offered. It was easier, it seemed, to write her out of the picture than to explain her presence in it. And yet, Alice's story didn't end in isolation. In the latter half of her life, she returned to the public eye, but on very different terms. She became a nun, founded an order of nursing sisters, and worked with the poor in Athens during wartime. When the Nazis occupied Greece, she sheltered a Jewish family in her home, a fact that remained largely unrecognized until decades later. She died in Buckingham Palace, having returned in old age, but without ever being fully reabsorbed into the narrative of royal life. Her legacy, now occasionally acknowledged in documentaries and footnotes, is that of a woman simultaneously revered and rejected by her own lineage. A royal who didn't fit the script and was quietly edited out. And she wasn't alone. Other royals, particularly women who struggled with health issues, whether physical, emotional, or neurological, were often secluded, institutionalized, or simply erased from photographs and family trees. In a world obsessed with genetic perfection and symbolic continuity, anything that complicated the myth of the immaculate bloodline became a threat to be managed, not mourned. But what makes this particular silence so striking is that it wasn't enforced by public shame, it was internal. Self-censorship by a family trained for centuries to protect the institution above the individual. Which raises a haunting question. If even your suffering is a state secret, what part of you is allowed to be real? Of course, some secrets are hidden not just to preserve the image, but to bury connections. Connections the monarchy would rather pretend didn't exist. Because sometimes the shame isn't illness, it's relation. 6. Secret cousin relations in the aristocracy with royal ties. In aristocratic circles, family trees are less like trees and more like tightly wound vines, looping, layered, inbred, and entangled to the point of collapse. Titles may stretch across continents, but bloodlines often double back on themselves, which is how, in the case of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, two first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II ended up hidden away in an institution, effectively erased from the royal narrative, for decades. Their story begins not in scandal, but in quiet, bureaucratic cruelty. Both women were born into the upper branches of the British aristocracy, granddaughters of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and nieces to the Queen Mother. But they were also born with developmental disabilities at a time when such differences were not only misunderstood, but feared. Not just by society, but by the very families who claimed to represent moral and genetic superiority. By the 1940s, the sisters were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, a state institution that was, in many ways, the end of the line. They lived under assumed identities, listed as dead in public records, while their extended family continued to pose for portraits, accept honors, and wave from palace balconies. For nearly 40 years, Nerissa and Catherine lived institutional lives, overlooked, unvisited, and almost entirely forgotten by the world that once toasted their birth announcements in crystal. Why the secrecy? The official line was silence. The unofficial one, whispered among biographers and journalists, was that the existence of disabled royals, so close to the crown, threatened the mythology of a perfect, divinely anointed bloodline. Eugenicist thinking, still disturbingly influential in elite British circles during the early 20th century, held that mental disabilities were hereditary, something shameful, something to be managed quietly. And so they were. The palace said nothing. The Queen Mother is reported to have never visited. The scandal finally cracked open in the 1980s, when a tabloid reporter unearthed records showing that both women were very much alive, and had been for years. There was no denial, just a kind of vague embarrassment, wrapped in the language of duty and difficult decisions. Biographies that once listed the sisters as deceased were hastily corrected. The women were still alive, still institutionalized, still unaware of the media storm erupting around their names. What makes this story especially chilling isn't just the act of concealment. It's the ease with which it was done. In a family whose entire power is built on symbolism, inconvenient realities are not debated, they are deleted. The erasure of Nerissa and Catherine wasn't an isolated act of neglect. It was a calculated act of narrative control. And yet, the irony runs deeper. Because even as the family was scrubbing out the records of those it considered too different to acknowledge, it was embracing something else entirely behind closed doors. Secrets of surveillance, of shadows, and of watchers watching watchers. Because in the royal world, if you're not being hidden, you might be the one doing the hiding. 7. Secret spying or intelligence links. Involving royals. The British royal family has always maintained a practiced posture of detachment. above politics, untouched by scandal, too ceremonial to meddle. But behind the ermine and ceremony lies another reality. The Windsors, like any powerful institution, have their own links to the silent machinery of intelligence. Not just as passive recipients of information, but at times as participants in a long-standing dance with secrecy, surveillance, and shadows. The most famous crack in the royal intelligence divide is Anthony Blunt, the Queen's art advisor turned Soviet double agent. But he wasn't the only figure brushing shoulders with spy masters. Blunt was merely the visible symptom of a much broader, much older relationship between royalty and espionage. Let's start with the basics. The monarch receives daily intelligence briefings. Not suggestions, not summaries. Classified briefings. Unlike prime ministers who come and go with elections, the monarch is the only unelected figurehead to receive these updates every day, regardless of their age, health, or level of political involvement. This means the king, and before him, the queen, has access to more continuous intelligence than most career politicians ever dream of. This isn't new. During World War II, King George VI worked closely with the secret services, often receiving reports from MI5 and MI6 directly. His daughter, Elizabeth II, inherited not just the throne, but this intricate web of intelligence briefings. Over her record-breaking reign, she reportedly developed close working relationships with several directors of intelligence agencies. These weren't ceremonial chats over tea. These were security briefings held behind sealed doors, in rooms without windows. And then there are the unspoken arrangements. Instances where royal influence quietly steered the direction of intelligence priorities. In exchange, the royals enjoyed something rarer than privilege: protection. For decades, journalists attempting to uncover the royal family's private dealings, whether financial, political, or personal, found themselves under subtle but unmistakable scrutiny. Sometimes it was legal pressure. Sometimes it was quiet dissuasion. But occasionally, it was surveillance. Reports surfaced in the 1980s that Princess Margaret's phone had been bugged. Not by enemies, but by friendly agencies concerned about the nature of her friendships. In the 2000s, there were accusations of private investigators being deployed, allegedly by royal-linked sources, to monitor staff, lovers, and journalists. Even Prince Charles, now king, was once suspected of commissioning background checks on aides and household members. And it didn't stop there. Some royals have been patrons of intelligence-connected charities. Others have visited MI5 headquarters, not for photo ops, but for strategy sessions, however symbolic. The line between constitutional neutrality and strategic interest has always been thinner than it looks on paper. None of this proves active participation in spying, at least not in the James Bond sense, but the quiet collaboration between monarchy and intelligence suggests something else. That even in a ceremonial role, power whispers. It moves in shadow, and sometimes it listens in the dark. But while some secrets were preserved in silence and others enforced through surveillance, not all royal secrets were wrapped in the language of duty. Some were simply the oldest kind in human history, secrets of desire, affairs that happened behind closed doors, then behind more doors, until even the palace couldn't deny them forever. 8. Scandalous marital or extramarital affairs kept hidden. To the public, royal marriage is a performance. A wedding is not a private promise, but a national broadcast. A kiss on the balcony isn't affection, it's choreography. But what happens after the confetti settles and the carriages are parked? Well, for some members of the British royal family, that's where the real stories begin. The ones not told in fairy tales, and definitely not printed on commemorative plates. Infidelity within royal circles isn't new. It's practically generational. But unlike the passionate scandals of celebrities or the public breakdowns of politicians, royal affairs have a different tone, calculated, hidden, and fiercely protected. Because an affair in Buckingham Palace isn't just a personal betrayal, it's a constitutional inconvenience. Start with King Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, whose romantic entanglements were so frequent and so public that the idea of royal discretion became more of a suggestion than a rule. He reportedly kept detailed lists of mistresses, installed secret entrances in royal homes, and had private rooms in clubs where discretion was the house policy. His affairs were widely rumored but rarely confirmed in any official sense, because acknowledgement would damage the illusion of royal virtue. And the illusion was everything. Fast forward to Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister. Her relationships, particularly the infamous romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend, ignited national debate, not just because of love, but because of optics. A divorced man was seen as scandalous company for a royal princess in the 1950s, and the palace leaned hard into containment mode. Public sympathy ran high, but institutional support did not. Margaret's later marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones would eventually collapse amid rumors of mutual affairs and emotional distance. But by then, the press had learned the rules. Speculate, but do not confirm. Not unless the palace does first. And then, of course, there's the marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, the modern royal relationship that tore through the veil of silence and laid bare what had long been whispered. That affairs, heartbreak, and media manipulation weren't accidents. They were inherited tools. Both parties, as later revealed, were unfaithful. But the institution wasn't equipped to deal with emotional reality. It was built for spectacle, not sincerity. For damage control, not healing. Even now, romantic rumors trail behind certain royal figures like persistent shadows, never fully proven, but never entirely dismissed. The press plays its part, tossing breadcrumbs but rarely crossing the invisible line of royal litigation. And the monarchy, in turn, offers a few smiles, a few distractions, and then silence. Because royal affairs aren't just about infidelity. They're about vulnerability. They threaten the myth of the unshakable family, the perfect heirs, the sacred bloodline. And most dangerously, they remind the public that even monarchs are moved by the same restless desires as everyone else, only with better curtains to hide behind. But for one royal, the affair wasn't just private scandal. It became a national crisis. Because when Edward VIII chose love over the crown, it wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a fracture in the institution itself. And it revealed another secret, one even darker than an affair. One that led not to divorce or heartbreak, but to fascism. 9. The abdication crisis and hidden Nazi sympathies. In 1936, King Edward VIII did something no British monarch had ever done before. He quit, stepped down, abdicated the throne. Officially, it was for love. The nation was told it was a tragic romance. The king had fallen for Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite, and because the Church of England wouldn't allow him to marry a divorcee while remaining head of the church, he chose her over the crown. It was Shakespearean, noble, almost romantic if you squinted. But the real story wasn't just about love. It was about ideology and danger. Because in the years after Edward's abdication, whispers began to leak. Rumors that he hadn't just left the throne for a woman, but had done so while holding deeply troubling sympathies for a rising power in Europe, Nazi Germany. During his short reign, Edward had already alarmed government officials with what they called reckless political opinions. He was critical of Britain's treatment of Germany after World War I. He disliked the parliamentary process. He distrusted his own ministers, and he admired, or at the very least tolerated, Adolf Hitler's version of order. After his abdication, these suspicions only deepened. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Germany in 1937, against advice, and were photographed meeting Hitler himself, smiling, shaking hands, touring Nazi facilities. It was more than just bad optics. Secret wartime documents, including the so-called Marburg files, unearthed by Allied forces after World War II, suggested that German officials viewed the Duke as sympathetic to their cause. There were discussions, allegedly, of reinstalling him on the British throne if the Nazis successfully invaded the UK. He was described in some intelligence reports as a man who could be useful. To them, not to Britain. The British government understandably panicked. The files were quietly buried for years. When they eventually surfaced in the 1950s, the damage control machine went into overdrive. Royal biographies softened the implications. Palace aides stressed that the Duke had been naive, not treasonous. Just another royal out of his depth. A man who loved too unwisely, spoke too casually, and walked away from duty with a little too much ease. But that's the thing about royal myths. They depend on clean breaks and tidy endings. And Edward's story is anything but tidy. His exile in France wasn't exactly punishment. He lived in comfort, hosted dinners, wrote memoirs, and complained frequently about how misunderstood he was. The palace never openly condemned his political views. The monarchy simply moved on, airbrushed his face from the wall of active players, and focused on a new narrative, that of duty, sacrifice, and wartime resilience, embodied by his brother George VI and eventually Queen Elizabeth II. The question no one wanted to ask aloud was, how close did the British throne come to becoming a fascist sympathizer's prize? And perhaps more disturbingly, how many others in the royal bloodline held similar sympathies? Quietly, privately, never caught on film? Because Edward wasn't the only royal whose existence made the palace uncomfortable. Others didn't leave for love or scandal. They simply disappeared. Hidden behind institution walls, mislabeled or misremembered, until even their own family forgot they were still alive. 10. Royal family members, institutionalized or hidden away. Not every royal story ends with exile, abdication, or a tell-all interview. Some never begin at all, at least not in the public eye. While certain high-profile scandals were contained with damage control and distraction, other members of the royal bloodline were managed more directly, through silence, institutions, and paperwork that quietly declared them irrelevant. The case of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, is often treated as a tragic outlier, but it wasn't an isolated event. The royal family has a longer, quieter history of quietly setting aside those who didn't fit the image, those whose existence disrupted the symmetry of the portrait. Throughout the 20th century, mental illness, neurodivergence, or developmental disabilities were considered not just medical matters, but potential social embarrassments in royal circles. When members of the extended family displayed signs of cognitive or emotional difference, the response wasn't support. It was removal. Sometimes to a hospital, sometimes to a private care facility, and sometimes simply to a place no one talked about. These weren't remote cousins living in unrelated branches of the family tree. They were close, daughters of dukes, nieces of queens, tied by blood and proximity to the throne. Yet once institutionalized, they were rarely, if ever, spoken of again. Public biographies listed them as deceased. Christmas cards no longer arrived. Official records were edited. Even other family members were reportedly unaware of their ongoing lives, or were told not to ask. The institutions themselves were a far cry from the comfort of royal residences. Facilities like the Royal Earlswood Hospital, where multiple relatives were placed, were state-run and overcrowded. Conditions were clinical at best, neglectful at worst. There were no royal doctors here, no state-of-the-art care. Just a quiet, bureaucratic exile, enforced by silence and sustained by indifference. To the monarchy, the logic was institutional preservation. Any visible deviation from the image of strength and stability was a liability. Royals were expected to embody order, mental, physical, and moral. A family member who didn't conform, through no fault of their own, risked unraveling the delicate tapestry of public perception. So they were hidden. Not out of malice, perhaps, but out of reflex, a learned instinct passed down through generations of image management. What makes these disappearances so unsettling is that they weren't the result of external scandal or public outcry. There were no press conferences, no lawsuits, no headlines, just names that quietly vanished from dinner lists and birth registries. And if you asked too many questions, the answers came wrapped in phrases like private matters or family discretion. The royal machine didn't need to lie outright. It simply changed the subject. And over time, even the most inconvenient truths fade if no one is allowed to remember them. But while some family members were quietly erased, others remained visible, if only because they were useful. Because beyond bloodline and duty, the monarchy has long curated another kind of collection. One built not of oil paintings, but of secrets hanging quietly in gold frames. 11. Hidden or fake portraits. Art scandals connected with royals. Art has always been the most flattering of mirrors, especially for monarchs. In the royal tradition, portraits aren't just records of faces. They're tools of mythology. Brushstrokes become diplomacy. Lighting becomes legacy. An idealized jawline can stand in for moral fortitude, and nowhere is that more true than inside Britain's royal palaces, where centuries of paintings, sculptures, and tapestries decorate the halls, each one reinforcing the idea of power as permanence. But behind the gilded frames and velvet ropes lies a more complicated truth. Because while the royal family is famous for preserving priceless art, it's also protected more than a few secrets hidden within those collections. Forgeries, misattributions, quiet cover-ups, and even outright scandals. Not all the faces hanging in the corridors are who they claim to be. Let's start with the paintings. The royal collection is one of the largest and most valuable art holdings in the world, estimated to include over 1 million pieces. But in the past few decades, art historians have raised uncomfortable questions about the authenticity of some works. Certain pieces once believed to be by old masters, Rembrandt, Titian, even Da Vinci, have been re-evaluated, and in some cases, quietly downgraded. The brushwork didn't match. The materials were wrong. In other words, some of the crown's most prestigious art was not quite what it appeared to be. Now, this isn't unique to the royals. Art misattribution is common, especially for centuries-old collections. But what makes it unusual is the way the palace responded. In many cases, instead of publicly announcing the reclassification, the changes were made quietly in catalogs and storage records. A portrait would quietly shift from studio of Rubens to follower of Rubens, or be rotated out of display without explanation. The myth of grandeur remained intact, only the facts changed. Then there's the matter of what gets displayed. Over the years, there have been rumors that certain royal portraits were hidden or destroyed, not for being inauthentic, but for being too revealing. Paintings that showed royals in unflattering light, both literally and figuratively. A particularly scathing likeness of Queen Victoria was allegedly misplaced for decades. A controversial sculpture of Edward VIII disappeared from public view shortly after his abdication. The Royal Archive, after all, is not a democracy. It's a vault with taste. And let's not forget the debts. Several royal estates, including Dumfries House in Scotland, were found to have quietly accumulated significant financial burdens related to art purchases, restorations, and secretive acquisitions. In one case, a controversial art dealer with ties to the royal household was investigated for selling overpriced pieces to the crown. Pieces that were later questioned by experts for their authenticity. The palace issued no comment. Art, after all, has always been a kind of plausible deniability. It looks beautiful. It says nothing. It can be hung, admired, and misremembered all in the same breath. And when questions arise, curators can always claim confusion. History, they'll say, is murky. But in royal circles, that murkiness isn't always accidental. Sometimes it's strategic. Sometimes what matters isn't whether a painting is real, but whether it's useful. And sometimes, what hangs in plain sight is less dangerous than what slips in through the window at night. Because not all breaches of royal security are metaphorical. Some are astonishingly, audaciously real. 12. Secret security breaches at royal residences. Buckingham Palace is supposed to be the most secure home in Britain. Part fortress, part stage, part living museum. It has guards in red coats, gates taller than basketball players, surveillance systems, and the kind of internal protocols that make high-level institutions look lax by comparison. It is, by all appearances, impenetrable. And yet, on a quiet summer night in 1982, a man named Michael Fagan climbed over the fence, scaled a drain pipe, tiptoed across the gravel, and entered the Queen's bedroom while she slept. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He wasn't part of an international plot. He was, by most accounts, a troubled man who just wanted to talk. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that he got in. Past security, past cameras, past protocols, and straight into the private chambers of the most protected woman in the United Kingdom. What happened next has been softened by time and turned into an odd footnote in royal lore. Some versions say the Queen remained calm, engaging him in conversation until help arrived. Others suggest she quietly triggered an alarm and left the room. The palace never confirmed the exact sequence, because it couldn't. To explain the failure would be to admit the institution's greatest vulnerability, that its security isn't infallible. Fagan's breach was shocking, but it wasn't the only one. Over the years, multiple attempts, successful and otherwise, have exposed worrying gaps in royal protection. In 2003, a journalist posing as a footman got a job at Windsor Castle during a security sweep. He reportedly served drinks at a royal event before the ruse was discovered. In 2013, an intruder broke into Buckingham Palace and roamed the corridors for several minutes before being arrested. In 2021, a man carrying a crossbow was arrested on the grounds of Windsor Castle, having recorded a video declaring his intent. These aren't urban legends. They're confirmed incidents. And yet, each time the story is quietly pushed out of the news cycle. The public is reassured. All protocols were followed. An isolated incident. No threat to the family. But the frequency and variety of breaches suggest a larger problem, that the idea of royal invincibility is more stagecraft than fact. There's a deeper irony here. The British monarchy has survived wars, revolutions, abdications, and endless public scrutiny. But what it struggles to manage is the chaos of the unexpected. The lone actor. The unplanned disruption. The man who climbs through the window not because he's dangerous, but because he simply can. It's not just about physical intrusion. It's about narrative disruption. The monarchy depends on control, ritual, and the illusion of divine order. When someone breaks in, that illusion cracks. And when it cracks, people start asking questions. Like, who's really watching the watchers? And just how many of the royal staff, those faceless, nameless figures who live in the background, know more than they're supposed to? Because the next royal secret wasn't carried in through the gates. It was raised inside them. And when she told the truth, they shut the door behind her. 13. Secret education, governess revelations. Every royal child is raised with two sets of lessons, the official curriculum and the unofficial code of survival. History books and French grammar are taught with all the expected decorum. But the real education, the one that teaches how to pose for portraits without blinking, how to nod without agreeing, and how to express warmth without saying too much, that education is passed down by a different kind of teacher. In the case of Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, that teacher was Marion Crawford, better known in royal circles as Crawfie. For over 16 years, she served as governess, tutor, and near-constant companion to the future queen and her younger sister. She was trusted, admired, welcomed into the inner circle of a family that prides itself on ironclad boundaries. And then, one day, she was gone. The reason? A book. In 1950, Marion Crawford published The Little Princesses, a memoir detailing her time with the young royals. It was not scandalous. It was not salacious. By modern standards, it read like a warm, slightly sanitized behind-the-scenes diary, charming anecdotes about bedtime routines, childhood pranks, and the quiet pressures of being groomed for a throne. It wasn't betrayal, but it was, in the eyes of the monarchy, something far worse: indiscretion. The response was immediate and severe. Crawford was ostracized, banned from royal circles, denied a grace and favor home that had once been promised to her. Her name was removed from official memory. No more Christmas cards, no acknowledgement of her service. She lived the rest of her life alone in a small cottage, occasionally visited by journalists and mostly ignored by the family she helped raise. Why such drastic retaliation for such a gentle book? Because the real taboo wasn't what she said, it was that she said anything at all. In the royal ecosystem, silence is not just preferred, it's expected. Staff members sign documents, make vows, absorb secrets, and carry them to the grave. The moment one of them speaks, even with kindness, the spell is broken. The illusion of untouchable mystique begins to fray. And so the monarchy responded not to the content, but to the precedent. And Crawford was just the beginning. Over the decades, other insiders, former footmen, aides, chefs, drivers, have released memoirs or granted interviews. Each time, the reaction is cold, calculated, and clear. The institution cannot afford to normalize candor. Every revealed detail, no matter how mundane, chips away at the porcelain mask. It raises a question of moral inversion. When loyalty demands silence, is truth a betrayal? Because for all its ceremonies and speeches, the monarchy isn't a democracy of memory. It's a curated myth, one in which the storytellers are always nobles or approved historians, never the help. But when silence is enforced so ruthlessly, it begins to rot the foundation from within, and eventually, even the most loyal institutions find themselves tempted to interfere, not just in memory, but in power. Because some secrets aren't about what the royals remember, but about what they try to change. 14. Secret lobbying or political influence. By the monarchy, constitutional monarchy, as defined on paper, is a harmless idea. The sovereign reigns, but does not rule. The monarch stays above politics, waving from balconies, hosting garden parties, and opening parliament with words written by someone else. It's the perfect arrangement for maintaining tradition without actually interfering with democracy. Except, that's not exactly how it works. For decades, the British royal family has quietly lobbied, influenced, and inserted itself into the mechanics of government, not through grand speeches or televised demands, but through private memos, subtle nudges, and the ancient privilege known as royal consent. It's a constitutional quirk that sounds ceremonial but carries sharp edges. In theory, it's a formality. In practice, it's a loophole. Here's how it works. Before certain legislation can be debated in Parliament, it must be shown to the monarch, or more specifically to their legal representatives. Not for approval, but for awareness. The phrase is polite. The reality is more assertive. Because during this review, changes can be requested. Sections of proposed laws can be revised, softened, or even quietly erased, all behind closed doors, with no public record of who said what or why. Over the years, investigative journalists and transparency advocates have unearthed multiple instances where the royal household allegedly used this privilege to shape legislation in its favor. In one case, laws were altered to protect the Queen's private wealth from transparency requirements. In another, exemptions were quietly granted to shield royal lands from environmental oversight. In others, the monarchy is said to have lobbied for greater discretion over household employment rules and pension provisions. What's most notable isn't just the content, it's the secrecy. Requests are made through intermediaries. Memos are buried in folders labeled routine correspondence. Ministers are instructed to treat discussions with utmost discretion. It's not illegal, but it is designed to leave no fingerprints. Defenders of the system insist it's a harmless process, a safeguard to ensure that legislation doesn't accidentally impact the monarch's symbolic duties or personal property. But critics argue it reflects a deeper truth, that the monarchy still wields influence not through authority, but through proximity. They don't rule, but they are always in the room, and sometimes that's enough. The late Queen Elizabeth II was reportedly meticulous in maintaining the appearance of neutrality, and yet the system around her operated with quiet persistence, lobbying behind the scenes even as she smiled in public. Her son, King Charles III, is known for having stronger opinions, especially on environmental and architectural issues. Before ascending the throne, he famously wrote dozens of letters to government ministers, now nicknamed the Black Spider Memos for their spidery handwriting and pointed tone. The content was often earnest. The existence? Controversial. Why should an unelected figure, however beloved, have that kind of access? The British public, for the most part, doesn't know the extent of this influence, and that's by design. The monarchy thrives in a space between reverence and redaction. It is both highly visible and intensely opaque. Every handshake is photographed. Every policy whisper is hidden in footnotes. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. For an institution that claims no political power, it spends a surprising amount of effort protecting its right to shape policy, quietly, discreetly, and with just enough plausible deniability. But lobbying is just one version of royal contingency. Because behind the palace walls, there's another category of preparation, not for influence, but for survival. Hidden playbooks, alternate blueprints, quietly maintained for the day everything goes wrong. And those plans? You're not meant to know they exist. 15. Secret contingency plans for monarchy continuity. If the British monarchy were a machine, then contingency is the oil that keeps it from seizing. What happens when a sovereign dies unexpectedly? What if an heir abdicates, vanishes, or becomes unsuitable? What if public opinion collapses overnight? These aren't hypothetical questions to the institution. They're operational scenarios. And behind the public-facing tradition of eternal calm lies a hidden catalog of secret plans, not just for mourning, but for monarchy itself. Some of these plans are well known, at least in outline. Operation London Bridge, the code name for Queen Elizabeth II's death protocol, was widely discussed by the time it activated in 2022. But what many people don't realize is that London Bridge is only one of many royal contingency plans quietly updated across decades. There's Operation Springtide for the ascension of a new monarch, Operation Menai Bridge for the death of King Charles III, Operation Unicorn for a royal death in Scotland, and countless unnamed protocols that govern the line of succession, coronation delays, and constitutional emergencies. These aren't ceremonial details. They're functional blueprints. Contingency planning in the monarchy doesn't just mean funeral rehearsals and flag protocols. It means determining who takes over if the heir is incapacitated. It means identifying legal gaps in royal assent if Parliament is in flux. It means preparing for scenarios where the monarchy itself, however unthinkable, is thrown into crisis. What if, for example, a scandal so large erupted that the reigning monarch had to step aside? There is no official mechanism for dethroning a king or queen short of legislation. But internally, palace aides have war-gamed versions of that scenario. Legal scholars have long speculated on the existence of hidden succession flowcharts, alternatives to the official line kept private in the event of constitutional deadlock or public revolt. Then there are the more obscure layers. Historical documents point to internal palace conversations about royal children born with severe health complications, and what that would mean for the succession. Other files, partially redacted, reference discussions about the fitness of certain heirs, a euphemism that raises more questions than it answers. In each case, the goal is the same: continuity, at all costs. And that continuity is not merely logistical, it's psychological. The monarchy depends on the idea of never-endingness, of being the one thing in British life that doesn't crash, collapse, or resign. But the very existence of these contingency plans reveals a contradiction. The crown is permanent, but always preparing to break. Why the secrecy? Because to admit the need for a backup plan is to admit the system might fail. And that's a dangerous thought when your entire public role is to symbolize stability. So instead, the plans are quietly updated, refined, and stored away. Not in vaults, but in memories, held by a small circle of aides, advisors, and private secretaries trained to activate them without hesitation. But continuity of the monarchy isn't just about logistics and legalities. It's also about belief. The crown survives not because of paperwork, but because people believe in its divine, historic inevitability. And that belief, too, is protected, fiercely. Sometimes, even against the royals themselves. Because what happens when the person wearing the crown starts asking questions of their own, especially about matters of faith, destiny, and doubt? 16. Secret religious or faith issues. If monarchy is theater, then religion is the script. The British sovereign isn't just a figurehead. They are, by constitutional definition, the defender of the faith and supreme governor of the Church of England. In other words, part king, part priest. The crown doesn't merely rest on royal blood. It rests on a carefully sanctified moral scaffolding that links the Windsors not just to Parliament, but to heaven itself, or at least to the appearance of it. But what happens when belief falters? When faith becomes private, complex, or inconvenient? That's the part of the script that gets rewritten off stage. Throughout royal history, personal religious struggles have been quietly buried beneath the weight of obligation. Monarchs were not expected to question, only to embody, and yet many did question. Some converted, some doubted, and some walked a very different path behind the scenes than the one shown in the Abbey. Take King Charles III. As Prince of Wales, he once raised eyebrows, and a few headlines when he suggested that the monarch should be seen not just as defender of the faith, but defender of faith in general. It was a semantic shift, yes, but one loaded with symbolic implications. In a multi-faith post-colonial Britain, the idea that the monarch might represent all spiritual paths, not just Anglican Christianity, was both progressive and deeply unsettling to traditionalists. Though Charles later clarified that he would uphold the Anglican role, the tension was obvious. How does a modern monarch balance the obligations of an ancient church with the realities of a globalized, pluralistic society? Especially when even within the palace, not everyone shares the same definition of belief. In the earlier generations, these tensions were treated as threats, not theological debates. Queen Victoria, for instance, was known for her intense personal spirituality, which often veered into mysticism. Her close relationship with John Brown, a Highland servant, included rituals and practices that made the church uneasy. Later, her interactions with Indian spiritual advisors were quietly discouraged, lest the Queen appear too Eastern in her sympathies. In more recent decades, private revelations about personal struggles with belief have occasionally leaked out. Snippets from letters, offhand remarks in interviews, anecdotes shared by close aides. Royals wrestling with meaning, with mortality, with the pressure of representing a divine order they may not privately feel. But these stories rarely make headlines. They are filtered, reframed, or ignored entirely. Even the royal family's relationship to death is shaped by this quiet censorship. While public funerals are steeped in Christian ritual, the private grief behind them is carefully sealed. Doubts, if they exist, remain undocumented. To serve as a symbol of divine right, you must not visibly waver, even when belief becomes performative. But perhaps the most haunting example of royal faith-related secrecy lies in the stories we're not told. Members of the family who may have experienced spiritual crises, mental health episodes tied to religious conviction, or conversions deemed too controversial to acknowledge. Stories of visions, private prayers, whispered fears. Episodes filed away as eccentric or personal, but never fully explained. Because to admit that the royal family, the literal head of the church, might privately wrestle with belief is to poke a very old bear, the myth of divine right. The very idea that monarchs rule not because of birth alone, but because they are chosen, anointed, and when you start questioning divine selection, you might start questioning everything else that comes with it, like moral certainty, or infallibility, or the illusion of control. Especially when, historically speaking, there's one temptation no royal seems fully immune to, the gamble. 17. Secret scandals of gambling or illicit behavior. There's something inherently contradictory about royal restraint. While British monarchs are expected to embody moderation, dignity, and self-control, their private lives often tell a different story. One filled with excess, indulgence, and the occasional wager that spirals out of control. Gambling has long been one of the monarchy's most quietly tolerated vices. Not because it's morally defensible, but because it's historically embedded, passed down like silverware, or bad advice. Perhaps the most notorious example was the royal baccarat scandal of 1890, a story so strange, so embarrassingly public, that the palace has tried to keep it in the dusty annex of historical footnotes. The central figure? The future King Edward VII, then the Prince of Wales. The setting? A country house weekend at Tranby Croft, complete with cigars, high society, and a card table that would become the scene of one of the most awkward royal cover-ups in living memory. Edward and a group of elite guests were playing baccarat, an illegal game at the time, and therefore already problematic, when one player, Sir William Gordon Cumming, was accused of cheating. Several guests claimed to have seen him manipulating the cards. A quiet agreement was made. Gordon Cumming would sign a letter vowing never to play cards again, and in return, the matter would stay confidential. Except it didn't. Word leaked. Gordon Cumming sued for defamation, and suddenly the Prince of Wales found himself dragged into a public courtroom to testify about a secret gambling party that not only breached the law, but cracked the facade of royal decorum. The trial became a media sensation. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the century. Crowds gathered, moralists tutted, and though the prince denied any wrongdoing, the damage was done. Gordon Cumming lost the case, but Edward's reputation was bruised. The public had seen behind the curtain, and they didn't like what they found. But the baccarat scandal was hardly an isolated incident. Edward's entire life was a masterclass in indulgence. Horse racing, private clubs, mistresses, and all-night dinners. Gambling wasn't a side hobby. It was part of the lifestyle. And he wasn't alone. Members of the aristocracy surrounding the crown, dukes, earls, distant cousins with just enough royal blood to feel invincible, were known for wagering fortunes on everything from card games to cockfights. Some lost homes, some lost titles, but the institution remained silent. In more recent times, royal associations with gambling have become more discreet, but not non-existent. Horse racing remains a royal passion, with significant sums quietly funneled through sporting investments. Certain family members have been linked to private casinos, discreet betting syndicates, or high-stakes poker games held in countryside estates. Nothing illegal per se, just quietly out of reach. The pattern is clear. What begins as a leisure activity becomes a liability, and what becomes a liability is quickly reframed as tradition. The royal family doesn't gamble, officially. They engage in patronage, support, sporting interest. Euphemisms become defense mechanisms, but beneath the polite language lies a recurring truth. That proximity to absolute privilege makes temptation harder to resist. When you grow up in palaces, the rules begin to feel optional, and the stakes, paradoxically, feel lower, until they aren't. Because behind the doors where wagers are placed, other kinds of risks unfold, the kind not measured in chips or cards, but in private despair. And when that despair is hidden for too long, it becomes something even the monarchy fears acknowledging. Not scandal, but suffering. 18. Secret mental health issues or suicide attempts. The British monarchy has always been fluent in symbolism, unity, composure, tradition. Emotions are managed, grief is scheduled, and personal struggles are carefully edited out of the public frame. For a family that serves as a living symbol of national stability, the idea of inner turmoil, especially psychological turmoil, doesn't just clash with the image, it threatens the entire brand. Which is why, historically, mental health within royal circles has not been addressed, but absorbed. Not acknowledged, but contained. And in some cases, hidden entirely. Go back far enough and you'll find George III, the mad king of British legend, whose mental health struggles were dramatized, mocked, and mythologized in equal measure. Today, historians believe he may have suffered from bipolar disorder or a genetic illness, like porphyria. But at the time, his symptoms were treated as divine punishment, personal weakness, or political inconvenience. His outbursts were managed by locking him away from view. His decline became less of a health issue and more of a constitutional crisis, one resolved by creating a regency while maintaining the fiction that the monarch still ruled. That model, isolate, obscure, maintain the illusion, would be repeated again and again. In the 20th century, these struggles became harder to suppress, especially as the media grew more invasive. But the instinct remained the same: protect the institution first. When royals displayed signs of emotional distress, it was rarely spoken about in public. If it was addressed at all, it was reframed through the lens of duty, exhaustion, or media pressure. Never as illness. Never as something that might warrant compassion rather than caution. Whispers have long circulated about various members of the royal family struggling in private. Some faced periods of deep depression. Others, according to memoirs and off-record accounts, engaged in alarming behaviors: self-isolation, erratic episodes, prolonged disappearances from public life. But unlike physical ailments, which could be explained with vague references to rest or minor procedures, mental health was considered unmentionable. The palace preferred euphemism: emotional strain, personal challenges, or the ever-popular needing time out of the spotlight. It wasn't just a communication strategy. It was institutional muscle memory. Vulnerability, after all, doesn't test well in royal optics. But the real tragedy isn't just in the suppression. It's in the isolation it creates. Because when no one inside the system is allowed to say, "I'm struggling," no one inside the system learns how to respond when someone else is. The result is a cycle of silence, where personal suffering is met not with empathy but with architecture. A bigger gate, a tighter schedule, a revised itinerary. Even in more modern contexts, where mental health is discussed more openly in public life, the monarchy has remained tentative. Statements are issued, causes are endorsed, but when it comes to their own family members, the candor disappears. There's always a line between advocacy and admission, and the crown rarely crosses it. The question remains: how many members of the royal family have suffered silently because breaking that silence would be treated not as healing, but as betrayal? And what does it mean when the institution designed to represent strength is built on the suppression of its own fragility. Because when you hide the hurt, you also hide the help. And into that vacuum step other figures, those less interested in compassion and more interested in control. Some influential, some powerful, some dangerous. And in at least one case, a royal relationship with such a figure nearly rewrote the family's image. Not with kindness, but with shadows. 19. Hidden relationships with controversial figures. In royal circles, associations are everything. A handshake can signal endorsement. A dinner guest can become a scandal. And in a world where public image is currency, the company you keep can determine the fate of your legacy. The British royal family has long understood this, and has spent decades carefully curating its visible affiliations. But it's the invisible ones, the hidden friendships, the private meetings, the questionable alliances, that leave the deepest shadows. Of all the unsettling relationships in royal history, the most infamous remains that of Edward VIII, the former king who abdicated the throne in 1936, and his deeply problematic sympathies toward Nazi Germany. His friendship with Adolf Hitler is no longer a secret. Photographs exist, documents exist. A documented visit to Germany in 1937 exists. He and Wallace Simpson, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, toured Nazi facilities as honored guests, smiling for the camera while the world edged toward catastrophe. But Edward's story isn't just about a rogue royal. It revealed how the monarchy could, in moments of miscalculation, align itself, however unintentionally, with regimes and figures who stood in direct opposition to the very values the crown claimed to uphold. And it raised the question, how many other such connections have been overlooked, hidden, or quietly managed into irrelevance? The truth is, royalty has always been a magnet for powerful outsiders. Dictators, oligarchs, media barons, and arms dealers have all found ways, through charity events, private introductions, or aristocratic intermediaries, to get close to the throne. Sometimes it's about influence. Sometimes it's about legitimacy. Being photographed with a royal, dining with one, or even being mentioned in the same room can confer a kind of unspoken validation. Over the years, royal figures have been linked, either directly or through social networks, to individuals later revealed to be involved in everything from political extremism to financial corruption. Some of these relationships were strategic, others were simply ill-advised. In most cases, the palace response was the same. Deny formal association, express regret, move on, and hope the public forgets faster than the headlines can resurface. The problem is, some associations leave a trail. A letter, a leaked memo, a photograph from a reception that no one remembers attending until it's on the front page. One particularly controversial figure, later arrested for crimes far removed from royal protocol, was known to have attended multiple palace events. At the time, he was described as a philanthropist. Only later did the full extent of his behavior come to light, by which point the palace had already begun its slow-motion distancing act. What's striking is not just the presence of these figures, but the persistence of access. The monarchy, for all its security and discretion, has occasionally allowed certain individuals into its orbit who clearly understood the value of proximity. Not just for vanity, but for protection. To appear royal adjacent is to appear untouchable, until suddenly, you're not. These relationships, once exposed, force a troubling reframe. Because if royalty is supposed to represent moral clarity, how does it explain these blurred alliances? How does it reconcile the handshake with the headline? Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps it simply pivots, as it always has, to the next story, the next photo op, the next generation. But even as it does, the question remains, what other connections have yet to come to light? And more disturbingly, what if those relationships weren't limited to power and politics? but blood. Because the next secret doesn't involve meetings or scandals. It involves entire people, born quietly, acknowledged privately, and then erased. 20. Secrets about children, born out of wedlock or disputed parentage. For a family obsessed with lineage, few things are more destabilizing than uncertainty. The British monarchy is built, brick by gilded brick, on the sanctity of succession. Who was born when, to whom, under what circumstances, and with what proof? It's not just family history, it's national infrastructure. Every royal heir is a constitutional placeholder. Every branch of the family tree is supposed to be pre-approved, publicly acknowledged, and polished for display. Which makes the existence of disputed parentage, or worse, unacknowledged children, more than scandalous. It's existential. Over the centuries, rumors have trailed behind royal carriages like unwanted confetti. Children born to mistresses, illegitimate lines of descent, quiet financial arrangements, distant cousins in exile, and always, always, denial. One of the most persistent stories involves James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II. Though born out of wedlock, he was raised with royal privileges and publicly favored by his father. When Charles died without a legitimate heir, Monmouth made a bid for the throne, leading a failed rebellion and ultimately losing both the crown and his head. But the episode revealed something crucial about the monarchy. Even the appearance of royal blood could be enough to rally armies. Which is precisely why the crown has since worked so hard to control the narrative of birth. In more modern eras, the stakes haven't changed, just the language. Rumors about illegitimate children continued to surround various royal figures well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Some alleged liaisons produced children who grew up in silence, unaware, or sometimes very aware, of their suspected lineage. In the age of DNA testing and social media, a few have stepped forward with claims, letters, photographs, or even genetic evidence, and each time the palace has met them with the same response: no comment. Legally, of course, it's almost impossible to force recognition without documentation. But morally, the silence is deafening. These are not accusations of scandal for scandal's sake. These are people, living lives shaped by the absence of acknowledgement. In some cases, their mothers were paid off. In others, they were quietly exiled. And in the rare instances where financial support was given, it was almost always wrapped in legal agreements ensuring lifelong discretion. Even within the aristocracy surrounding the royal family, disputed parentage has been treated as a manageable inconvenience, something to be erased by marriage, denied by paperwork, or handled behind estate walls. Titles pass smoothly, explanations do not. Why does it matter? Because monarchy, unlike celebrity, depends on uncontested bloodlines. A single unacknowledged child, if proven, wouldn't just disrupt family gatherings. It could technically challenge succession, undermine legitimacy, or cast doubt on the very narrative the monarchy sells to its people, that of divine, unbroken order. So the strategy has been simple. Deny the story, not the existence. Let the rumors remain rumors. Let the claimants age into irrelevance. And meanwhile, continue presenting the family as tightly managed, perfectly composed, and entirely accounted for. But sometimes the children aren't hidden at all, just the traditions that surround them. Because beyond bloodlines and birthrights, the monarchy holds something even more protected than its heirs, its rituals. The ones you never see, the ones you're not meant to understand, the ones that, once revealed, ask an even stranger question. What exactly are they still doing behind closed doors? 21. Secret ceremonies or protocols, unknown to public. To outsiders, the British monarchy may appear as a living museum, orderly, symbolic, ceremonial to the point of satire. Crowns, carriages, balcony waves, curtsies timed like choreography. Everything visible feels rehearsed, predictable, and oddly comforting in its pageantry. But for all the pomp on display, there exists a second layer of ritual, one that unfolds far from the cameras, quiet, precise, and largely unknown to the public. These are not the ceremonies you see on television. These are the ones you're not even supposed to know exist. Some of them are tied to succession. When a monarch dies, it's not just a national moment of mourning. It's the activation of a centuries-old machine. But before Operation London Bridge rolls out its sequence of flags, announcements, and televised memorials, there's a lesser-known process: the immediate and private rituals of death. Royal aides are summoned with coded phrases. Black armbands are distributed. A royal undertaker, yes, that's a real title, is called in before the press is even briefed. And then, of course, there's the Accession Council, which meets to proclaim the new monarch. A ritual so steeped in secrecy that, until recently, it wasn't even televised. Attendees are made to stand, speak in unison, and sign documents whose origins trace back to medieval law. Even the ink used is traditional. The phrasing must be exact. Any deviation is recorded, and quietly corrected next time. Beyond these constitutional ceremonies lie rituals of personal transition, and at times, control. When a new monarch ascends, certain employees are dismissed automatically. Others are required to re-swear oaths. And somewhere in the basement of every royal residence are the unseen rituals of power maintenance. Handwritten ledgers, heirloom inventories, ancient prayers read over private rooms. Some of these practices are barely understood by those performing them, carried out more from habit than belief. But they persist. There are stories of royal children participating in midnight rehearsals for coronation rites, of minor royals being required to observe obscure gestures of deference that haven't changed since the 1600s, and of courtiers who must memorize entire scripts of ceremonial responses in case of sudden death or abdication, protocols no one hopes to use, but everyone is required to know. Then there are the religious components, many never filmed or even discussed publicly. The anointing of the monarch during coronation, for example, is considered so sacred that it is shielded from cameras entirely. What is said, what is prayed, and how the oil is applied remain private, tucked away under golden canopies and behind cathedral screens. It's part of the illusion that even in a secular age, the monarchy maintains some access to the divine, and that illusion is critical. Because once the sacred becomes explainable, it becomes dispensable. If the public begins to understand too much, to see the mechanics behind the myth, the spell breaks. So the rituals stay hidden, not because they're dangerous, but because they're fragile. But what happens when secrecy moves beyond ceremony? When hidden customs aren't just about tradition, but about power, exerted behind closed doors, sometimes even within the family itself? Because the next royal secret doesn't involve crowns, robes, or ancestral chants. It involves bruises that don't show up in portraits, and the kind of silence that doesn't come from reverence, but from fear. 22. Secret internal family violence or abuse. For all its grandeur, the British royal family is still, at its core, a family, complete with rivalries, resentment, hierarchy, and generational tension, dressed up in gold braid and antique furniture. But unlike ordinary families, this one comes with staff, state secrets, and a century-deep instruction manual on how to make anything unpleasant disappear, including, it seems, itself. Among the most quietly buried allegations within the monarchy's long history are those of emotional cruelty and behind-closed-doors abuse. Not from enemies, not from the outside world, but from within the royal household itself. To be clear, not all of this is documented in legal filings or revealed in scandalous interviews. Much of it exists in the murky gray zone of historical implication, off-the-record memoirs, and insider whispers, the kind of stories that never make front pages but are repeated in biographies with phrases like temperamental, volatile, or difficult behind the scenes. Royal households, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, operated more like military units than homes. Discipline was enforced through rank. Children were raised not by parents but by nannies and governesses who were expected to uphold the values of silence, stiffness, and obedience. Emotional warmth was optional. Physical correction was common. Those who stepped out of line, including young royals, were not guided. They were corrected, sometimes harshly. Queen Victoria, for instance, was famously stern with her children, describing them in letters with cold detachment and rarely praising their efforts. Her son, Edward VII, reportedly grew up craving affection and overcompensated in adulthood with indulgence and rebellion. It's not hard to draw a psychological line between those withheld embraces and the adult behavior that followed. In more modern times, accusations of royal harshness have surfaced more obliquely. Biographers of Prince Philip often referred to his disciplinarian style, describing him as rigid and demanding with his children, particularly Charles, who by many accounts struggled under his father's high expectations and sarcasm. Emotional distance was interpreted as character building. Vulnerability was viewed as weakness. Some former palace staff have hinted at a culture of intimidation, not physical in the overt sense, but emotionally corrosive. Raised voices, withering criticism, a deep hierarchy that discouraged disagreement and punished dissent. Staff who spoke out were quietly reassigned, retired early, or made redundant. And within the family, grievances were managed not through resolution, but through removal. Invitations stopped arriving, phone calls went unanswered, and proximity to the monarch was quietly revoked. And what about the victims of such behavior, if they existed? In royal life, you don't make complaints, you disappear, sometimes to country estates, sometimes to foreign postings, sometimes into the polite oblivion of being no longer a working royal. It's exile by decorum, because unlike political scandals or romantic indiscretions, internal mistreatment is harder to explain away. It suggests not dysfunction, but institutional rot. And that's the one narrative the monarchy cannot afford, the idea that, beneath the uniforms and protocol, there exists a pattern of damage, handed down like heirlooms. But in some cases, it's not just emotional scars that remain hidden. Sometimes, what's concealed is far more clinical, buried not in memory, but in medical files. Because the next secret doesn't involve the past. It involves treatments that were never supposed to happen, or at least never supposed to be known. 23. Secret medical experiments or involvements. The British royal family is a centuries-old institution built on the illusion of certainty, the certainty of bloodlines, of moral clarity, of physical health. But when illness enters the royal frame, the approach is rarely straightforward. And when medicine meets monarchy, history becomes complicated. Quietly, over the years, members of the royal family and their extended circle have been linked to strange medical procedures, discreet experimental treatments, and deeply private health trials that never made it into official histories, or were buried beneath layers of protocol and privacy. The royal body is not just a person, it's a symbol, which means any sign of weakness, especially one requiring unorthodox medical intervention, is handled behind locked doors, sometimes with the help of the finest specialists in Britain, other times with a nod to emerging unproven methods that would raise eyebrows if they involved anyone outside palace walls. Take, for instance, the royal interest in alternative medicine. Over the years, there have been credible reports of royals seeking homeopathy, experimental therapies, and fringe treatments, often long before such practices became mainstream. Some of this was personal curiosity. Some was desperation. But some, according to insider accounts, may have involved untested methods being quietly trialed on willing, or semi-willing, royal patients, far from public view. Queen Victoria's household, for example, kept close contact with early practitioners of animal magnetism and spiritual healing. Though rarely discussed officially, her interest in such practices, and the physicians who promised physical and emotional calm through unconventional means, created a precedent for royal experimentation. She wasn't alone. Many in her circle believed certain illnesses were best treated through balance, electricity, or natural philosophy, all polite euphemisms for what we'd now call speculative science. In the 20th century, things didn't exactly modernize. Certain aristocrats connected to the crown underwent therapies that were, at best, innovative and, at worst, unregulated. Some were sent abroad for secret procedures in Swiss clinics. Others received experimental psychiatric treatment, often without fully understanding the implications. Records of these events are sparse by design. In some cases, names were removed entirely. In others, medical professionals were bound by lifelong non-disclosure. King George VI reportedly underwent a highly experimental procedure to remove part of his lung in secrecy, under the cover of darkness at Buckingham Palace. The operation was successful, technically, but the details were only revealed years later. Even then, reports were incomplete, phrased delicately, and cleared by royal aides before reaching the press. The pattern here is not one of conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but of control. Complete and unrelenting control. Control over narrative, over information, over bodies themselves. The monarchy doesn't merely guard secrets of wealth and succession. It guards the vulnerability of the flesh. And when that vulnerability becomes too visible, it's either rewritten or erased. The idea of royal participation in medical trials, even private ones, isn't inherently scandalous. But the secrecy surrounding it is, because if the royal body is sacred, then so is the act of treating it. And if mistakes are made, they are not admitted. They are buried. Quietly, with ceremony. But sometimes the most sensitive information isn't stored in vaults or surgical records. Sometimes it's scribbled in a diary, typed in a letter, tucked between pages of private correspondence that was never meant for public eyes. And when those pages surface, they don't just reveal pain. They reveal what the royals really thought when they weren't performing. 24. Secret private correspondence. Revealing true feelings. It's easy to forget that the British royals, poised, practiced, perpetually composed, are still people. Under the layers of statecraft and ceremonial velvet lies the same mess of doubt, insecurity, and internal monologue that fills any human life. But while most people's private thoughts are protected by forgetfulness, illegible handwriting, or a good bonfire, the royals have a problem. They write things down, carefully, constantly, and those things, inevitably, leak. Private correspondence has always been the backstage of monarchy, a dimly lit place where the curtains are thin and the voices are real. Here, kings confess regret, queens question their marriages, siblings fume over inheritance, and courtiers, those ever-loyal shadows, whisper opinions they'd never speak in a drawing room. These letters and diaries are never intended for public consumption, which is exactly why they matter. Take Queen Victoria, for example. She was one of the most prolific letter writers of any monarch. Her journals stretch into the thousands of pages, many of them deeply emotional, obsessively detailed, and surprisingly unfiltered. She wrote about love, loathing, political annoyance, physical pain, religious conflict, even her irritation at how her children turned out. When her daughter Beatrice edited and rewrote much of the Queen's journals after her death, she removed huge swathes of material, entire moods, generations of gossip, deleted, not to protect privacy, but to protect the illusion. But not all royal edits came in time. In the modern era, caches of personal letters have surfaced through auctions, leaks, or private family collections. Some are full of affection, revealing surprising tenderness from figures often portrayed as cold. Others are dripping with passive aggression. There are letters in which future monarchs criticize their subjects, complain about ministers, or openly mock other countries' leaders. What makes these so shocking isn't the content, it's the candor. The late Queen Elizabeth II, famously tight-lipped in public, was reportedly far more expressive in private correspondence. Sources suggest she kept a meticulous daily diary, not for the public record, but as a personal ritual. Its contents remain sealed. For now. But other documents have slipped out, including sharp memos, handwritten notes, and reflective letters that occasionally hint at irritation, grief, or exasperation with royal life itself. Even more intriguing are the letters between royals and non-royals, secret lovers, unofficial advisors, estranged relatives. These documents are often where the mask slips most, where a prince admits fear, where a duchess strategizes her next move, where old rules are broken with a carefully chosen word or a deceptively affectionate sign-off. And then there are the vanished letters, the ones deliberately destroyed or misplaced, or quietly bought back from auction houses by anonymous bidders who definitely weren't sent by the palace. The absence of these letters tells its own story, not just of content, but of intent. What does it say when a family guards its private emotions more fiercely than its crown jewels? Of course, it's not always what's written that matters. It's who reads it. When historians stumble upon these correspondences, they often do so decades too late. The context is gone. The people are dead. But the voice remains, hovering on the page like a ghost with unfinished business. And in some cases, those ghosts don't rest quietly. Because as we follow the trail of words that were never meant to be seen, we stumble into stories far older and darker than any individual letter. Stories about empire, silence, and the uncomfortable truth about what the royals did in the name of greatness. 25. Secret involvement in colonial and imperial abuses. For centuries, the British monarchy sat atop an empire so vast it required time zones just to comprehend it. From tea plantations in India to gold mines in Africa, from sugarcane fields in the Caribbean to sheep farms in Australia, the empire was a machine powered by trade, bureaucracy, and quietly, the monarchy's moral signature. It was the crown, quite literally, stamped onto coins, flags, legal documents, and heads of state. And yet, when people today ask about the British royal family's role in colonialism, the answers are usually vague, general, sanitized. It was a different time, the refrain goes, as if a different clock absolves the same hands. But behind closed doors, the monarchy was not a passive bystander to imperialism. It was a participant, not always the director, but often the beneficiary, sometimes the symbol, and occasionally the enabler. Queen Victoria didn't just preside over the empire, she embodied it. Statues of her were shipped around the globe like talismans of civility, dropped into colonized capitals to establish the illusion of benevolent oversight. Her image adorned everything from postage stamps to imperial decrees. She was marketed as a mother to the empire, even as the empire's children were taken, taxed, and transformed. In private letters, Queen Victoria referred to colonial subjects with the sort of language that rarely makes it into school textbooks. Her views were shaped by the era, of course, but also by advisors, governors, and aristocrats who painted conquest as moral duty. It wasn't just about expansion. It was about elevation, civilizing, saving. So the narrative went. Later monarchs took a more hands-off approach, delegating authority to politicians and administrators. But even then, the royal family continued to benefit, financially, reputationally, and symbolically. Land acquired through imperial policies often ended up enriching royal estates. Ceremonies involving colonized rulers reinforced British supremacy, with kneeling princes and queenly patronage posing for history books like "Everything was fine." Documents have emerged, buried in archives, only partially released, that suggest the royal household knew more about certain colonial atrocities than it publicly acknowledged. In some cases, records were misplaced. In others, access was denied under national security grounds. When a few files were unsealed decades later, they revealed a troubling proximity between royal advisors and imperial operations. Requests for silence, diplomatic nudges, financial distancing, all wrapped in the courteous language of discretion. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of this hidden involvement came not from paperwork, but from protocol. When independence ceremonies were held across the former empire, Ghana, India, Kenya, Barbados, they were often overseen by royals, smiling, shaking hands, watching flags fall and rise. They offered formal recognition, graceful exits, carefully choreographed gestures of goodwill, but little in the way of accountability. Today, the royal family walks a tightrope between tradition and change. A few public acknowledgments of sorrow or regret have emerged. Yet, there's still no formal apology for the empire, no institutional reckoning, no consistent return of wealth or artifacts acquired during the colonial era. Only curated moments of reflection, dressed in ceremonial tact. Because to apologize fully would require admitting something the monarchy has spent generations avoiding, that its history is not just pageantry and patriotism, but also plunder and pretense. That for all the crowns, carriages, and Commonwealth tours, there remains an empire-shaped shadow behind the throne. And some ghosts don't leave until you name them. But sometimes, secrets about past power aren't as fragile as the ones about future power. Which brings us to another topic not often printed on royal invitations: the secrets around succession, and the laws changed quietly to keep the crown in all the right hands. 26. Secrets around succession or change of law, quietly done. In monarchies, power doesn't transfer with ballots. It glides along the tightrope of bloodlines, tradition, and ancient paperwork. And when the British royal family needs to shift the rules of the game, they rarely announce it with trumpets. Instead, the gears turn silently behind palace walls. Legal ink dries in obscurity, and by the time the public notices, the deed has already been sealed with a wax stamp. For centuries, succession in Britain was governed by an uneasy cocktail of gender, religion, and politics. The monarchy's continuity depended on one crucial question: who gets the crown next, and who doesn't? But the answers weren't always predetermined by fate or fairness. Often they were adjusted, revised, or altogether rewritten when inconvenient realities crept in. Take the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. On the surface, it sounds quaint, a regulation ensuring royals don't elope with unsuitable suitors. In practice, it was a control mechanism. Any descendant of King George II required the monarch's permission to marry. Without it, their marriage was considered invalid. Translation: if you married someone the crown didn't approve of, you'd forfeit your place in line. Love was subject to royal sign-off, and the ink was usually conservative. This law held up for over 2 centuries, until it quietly began to crack under the pressure of modernity and public opinion. But even when it was repealed in 2015, replaced by the Succession to the Crown Act, the announcement was subdued, almost sleepy. No royal address, no parade of transparency. And yet, it changed everything. Suddenly, gender no longer dictated the throne. Before 2015, if a royal daughter was born before her brother, she'd still get leapfrogged. Now, primogeniture meant what it sounded like. The firstborn, regardless of gender, gets the crown. A milestone in theory, though conveniently applied only to royals born after October 28, 2011. The rest? Grandfathered into inequality. And then there's the matter of faith. British monarchs are still required to be in communion with the Church of England, a rule forged during the Protestant Reformation and solidified in law like wet cement. But quietly, In the same 2015 update, another archaic clause was softened. Royals could now marry Catholics without being disqualified from succession. Not be Catholic, mind you, just marry one. Baby steps. These legislative tweaks were passed through Parliament with little public fanfare, wrapped in the language of modernization. But the motivations were strategic. As the royal family's relevance was being questioned in the 21st century, it became politically vital to make them appear more progressive, even if the deeper architecture of monarchy remained as hierarchical and exclusive as ever. Even Queen Elizabeth II, famously apolitical in public, was known to have advised on these changes. The constitutional monarch, technically neutral, still managed to be conveniently aligned with preserving the monarchy's image. That's the genius of royal influence. It doesn't shout. It whispers just loud enough to be written into law. More recent questions about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children, their titles, their line to the throne, all of these reignited speculation about whether certain royal children are given the same rights, titles, and proximity to power. Official answers tend to cite protocol. Unofficially, whispers suggest quiet recalibrations behind closed doors. Ultimately, succession is the monarchy's beating heart. But it's guarded like a family vault. Tampering with it is taboo, unless, of course, the tampering happens in private. And if there's one thing the royals have always excelled at, it's making seismic change look like ceremonial routine. But while the crown may pass in secrecy, bloodlines often don't end where official charts say they do, which is where the whispers get louder. About secret hidden siblings and royal relatives quietly pushed abroad or erased from memory. 27. Secret hidden siblings or relations in other countries. If blood is thicker than water, royal blood is molasses. Slow-moving, sticky with secrets, and prone to clumping in unexpected places. For a family so obsessed with lineage, succession, and tightly curated family trees, the British royals seem to misplace an awful lot of relatives. Sometimes they're simply inconvenient. Sometimes they're quietly exiled. Sometimes they just stop appearing in photographs altogether. Officially, the royal family tree is mapped with surgical precision. Every branch, every cousin, every distant duchess dangling off the trunk of Windsor is accounted for. But official is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because in the shadowy alcoves of palace archives and ancestral estates, stories persist about hidden half-siblings, forgotten cousins, and long-lost relations whose only mistake was existing outside the monarchy's curated narrative. Let's start with the Bowes-Lyon sisters, Catherine and Nerissa, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II. Institutionalized for most of their lives in a hospital for the mentally disabled, yet their existence was listed in Burke's peerage as deceased, while they were very much alive, for decades, living in near anonymity. Their names weren't spoken in polite circles, their faces never seen on Christmas cards. It wasn't until journalists uncovered the truth in the 1980s that the public learned these women weren't ghosts. They were deliberately erased. Official reaction, muted. Family response, silence. But that was just the tip of the aristocratic iceberg. There are stories, ones that drift in and out of tabloids, conspiracy books, and late-night pub debates, about children fathered during wartime postings, heirs born from affairs, and even allegations of secret marriages that produced unacknowledged descendants. Are all of them true? Probably not. But that's the thing about the monarchy. Its need for image control makes even the most outlandish theories plausible. Because hiding family members isn't unprecedented. It's part of the royal playbook. Take the strange case of Queen Victoria's rumored offspring. While history records her 9 legitimate children in impressive genealogical detail, speculation has long existed about others, especially in her youth, during the time she was under the watchful eye of her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy. Victoria herself famously hated him. Some say it wasn't just political. Some claim her childhood, tightly monitored and restricted under the so-called Kensington system, was a gilded prison meant to contain more than just a strong-willed princess. Of course, none of this is officially recognized, which is exactly the point. And then there are the royal exiles, the family members who married unsuitable people and were quietly nudged out of the country, or those whose claims to relation were strong enough to be problematic, but not strong enough to be embraced. Rumors abound of cousins in Australia, second-removed siblings living in rural France, and alleged royal bloodlines branching out in Canada, Jamaica, and even India, often traced back to colonial-era indiscretions, strategic marriages, or hushed-up affairs. DNA testing, once the stuff of science fiction, is now a swipe away. And with it has come a renaissance of rediscovery. Long-lost cousins emerge with uncanny genetic matches. Ancestry.com notifications pop up like family ghosts at a coronation. Royal watchers have even speculated that this age of democratized genetics could force the monarchy into an awkward reckoning. What happens when forgotten branches come knocking? The answer, so far, has been avoidance. The firm operates on the principle that what isn't acknowledged doesn't exist. But as public appetite for transparency grows and digital sleuths close in on historical gaps, those old erasures start to feel less like errors and more like intentions. And speaking of intentions, money is a motive most families understand, especially when there's a lot of it. Which brings us to the next secret: how royal estates and assets, managed behind the scenes, quietly decayed into debt, dysfunction, and financial mystery. Not every palace is as polished as the brochure claims. 28. Secret mismanagement of properties or assets. For a family whose primary job description could be summed up as appear wealthy, the British royals have had an unexpectedly rocky relationship with actual wealth management. There's an illusion, carefully cultivated through centuries of portraits, pomp, and platinum jubilees, that everything under the crown's domain runs like clockwork. But illusions are expensive, and behind the polished facades of Windsor, Balmoral, and Sandringham, there lies another quieter story of crumbling estates, under-the-rug debt, and royal properties that have occasionally teetered on the edge of shabbiness. Let's start with the basics. The royal family does not own most of the famous properties we associate with them. Buckingham Palace, the Crown Estate, Windsor Castle, ditto. These are assets technically held in trust for the nation, but that technicality becomes hazy when you peek behind the velvet curtains. While the taxpayer funds the sovereign grant meant to maintain these state-owned properties, management of individual residences and lesser estates has often been left to private royal hands, and that's where things get interesting. For decades, the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall have functioned like old money investment portfolios, funding the private lives of senior royals without much oversight. Charming, in theory, except charm doesn't pay for roof repairs or patch up budget shortfalls. And more than once, royal properties have quietly fallen into disrepair while millions were siphoned into pet projects, staffing layers, or ceremonial spending. Case in point, the persistent rumors around Highgrove, King Charles III's beloved countryside retreat. Once described as a sustainability model, it reportedly operated at a loss for years, even as its organic gardens became a passion project. The estate, managed through the Duchy of Cornwall, was heavily marketed as a beacon of green living, but behind the compost bins and heritage apple trees, the books didn't always balance. Then there's the little matter of Sandringham. While often framed as the family's cozy rural home, it's also a working estate, farms, tenants, gamekeeping, and all. But even private estates are vulnerable to poor planning, weather fluctuations, and changing political climates. When EU farming subsidies dried up post-Brexit, estates like Sandringham faced questions about long-term sustainability. The solution? Keep the details vague, the public tours charming, and the real costs somewhere out of reach. Lesser-known properties haven't fared any better. Some have been sold off quietly, others leased out under obscure terms. Once grandeur-filled royal hunting lodges now serve as private rentals or sit vacant, their maintenance costs too awkward to justify publicly. A few even ended up in the hands of foreign billionaires, wrapped in limited companies and offshore arrangements that, conveniently, don't make headlines during Trooping the Color. The most baffling thing is that the royals aren't broke. Not by any reasonable standard. But for a family with access to priceless art, jewelry vaults, and state income streams, they've shown an almost aristocratic disdain for modern financial transparency. And that attitude trickles down to asset management. It's not that properties are always mismanaged. It's that mismanagement, when it happens, is allowed to age like fine wine, quietly, gracefully, and with no accountability. Of course, what's one decaying palace when the image remains pristine? That's the trade-off the monarchy has always made. As long as the public-facing side sparkles, what happens in the foundation doesn't matter. Until, of course, it does. Because some properties weren't just mismanaged, they were used for things no one wants to talk about. Places meant for diplomacy or leisure repurposed into secret venues. That's the next secret the monarchy would rather you didn't knock on the door about. 29. Secret use of palaces and residences for illicit purposes. Palaces are meant to be symbols of grandeur, sovereignty, the illusion that a single family can embody the will of a nation. But behind those gold-plated gates and perfectly polished drawing rooms, some of Britain's royal residences have lived double lives. Not all rooms in the palace are used for ceremonial receptions. Some are quietly sealed, some repurposed, and others, if certain stories are to be believed, used for purposes never written into the history books. Because the truth is, when you own vast networks of secluded, fortified estates that aren't subject to the usual inspections or public transparency, they can become the perfect backdrop for activities no one wants traced. Not necessarily illegal in a court of law sense, but definitely in the court of public opinion sense. Take Buckingham Palace, for example, a symbol of British endurance, monarchy, and diplomatic ritual. But beneath the ballroom and balconies lies a subterranean web of tunnels, staff quarters, security zones, and discreet entrances unknown to most. These tunnels have long been rumored to connect not only parts of the palace, but potentially other secure government buildings. Convenient for security, but also convenient for people coming and going without being seen. Then there's the curious case of Clarence House, historically a residence for royals between crowns or careers. A relatively low-profile location, nestled near St. James's Park, it's been whispered about in more than one intelligence memoir. Former aides have alluded to its use as a discreet meeting place for high-value visitors. Not scandalous in itself, until you consider who some of those visitors may have been. There are even older whispers around Fort Belvedere, the 18th-century Gothic-style castle best known as the love nest of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson during the abdication scandal. But that's only the part people talk about. The rest is a fog of speculation, covert government meetings, strange guest lists, and a level of autonomy that let it operate well out of sight for years. The property is now privately leased, its function sanitized. But its legacy is more than just decorative. And then we come to the real curiosity. Why would MI5 or MI6 ever need to use a palace? The answer isn't that they need to. It's that sometimes, no other place offers the same blend of privacy, status, and diplomatic immunity. Palaces are ideal pressure cookers, hush-hush environments where decisions are made, secrets exchanged, and no FOI request will ever crack the walls. Which leads us to the broader point. The monarchy, by nature, operates in a bubble of exemption. Royal residences don't get raided. Royal logs don't get audited. And anyone asking too many questions about unusual visitors, odd hours, or security exceptions will quickly find themselves met with that most British of responses, a tight-lipped smile and a change of subject. It's not just speculation. In 2003, the Daily Mirror ran an undercover investigation that revealed security flaws in royal residences. One reporter even got inside Buckingham Palace as a footman. But what he saw wasn't just lax protocols. It was a culture of silence, of rooms that were always locked, of staff who knew better than to ask what they were for. If anything truly illicit was happening, it didn't need to be hidden. It just needed to be accepted. So maybe the most unsettling truth is not that palaces were occasionally used for questionable purposes. It's that no one really expected otherwise. When power is hereditary, secrecy becomes a kind of inheritance too. And if those rooms could talk, what would they say about the people left behind, those whose royal blood wasn't quite blue enough to make it past the drawing room? Because sometimes the most tragic stories are the ones left out of the family photo altogether. 30. Secret neglect or hidden tragedies of lesser royal family members. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the survivors, or, in the case of the British royal family, by the ones who made it onto the balcony. For every polished portrait and heraldic crest, there's someone who didn't make the cut, someone with the right bloodline, but the wrong temperament, the wrong health condition, or simply the wrong timing. And in a system that thrives on optics, lineage alone was never quite enough to guarantee protection from obscurity or abandonment. The British royal family, sprawling as it is, includes not only kings and queens, but distant cousins, dukes, baronets, and forgotten branches of the family tree that withered quietly in the shade. Some of them were born into rooms lined with silk drapes and royal nurses. Others were quietly moved out of sight before they ever had the chance to cry in public. Take, for example, the case of Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. John was born into the golden glow of royal infancy in 1905, but when he began showing signs of epilepsy and developmental differences, the tone shifted. He was moved to a remote estate at Sandringham, away from public events, with limited visits from family. Official narratives described it as, for his health. But between the lines, a different picture forms. A royal child not quite fitting the image of a future empire. When he died at just 13, it was with barely a mention in court circles, a whisper, a footnote, a non-event. He wasn't the only one. Fast forward to the 20th century and you find cases like Catherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother, daughters of the aristocracy, and institutionalized for decades in a mental health facility. Their existence wasn't simply overlooked, it was actively erased. Official genealogies listed them as deceased, while they were very much alive, living out their days in a care home with no royal visits, no press inquiries, and no explanations. It was only decades later, long after their deaths, that their story was exposed, not through family disclosure, but via investigative journalism. Why the silence? Why the secrecy? Because in a family that functions as a living symbol, imperfection isn't just inconvenient, it's a liability. The monarchy isn't built for nuance. It's built for ceremonial perfection, for glossy annual reviews, for waving hands and immaculate Christmas speeches. Anyone who introduces complexity, illness, financial hardship, or personal tragedy risks breaking the fourth wall. Many lesser royals found themselves stripped of titles, pensions, or housing over generational changes and shifting royal priorities. Some quietly descended into financial difficulties. Others were simply forgotten, their royal heritage reduced to anecdotes or late-night Google searches. One former palace aide reportedly referred to these individuals as unofficial exiles, still related but out of frame, like old family photos turned to the wall. What these stories reveal isn't simply institutional neglect. It's an entire system built on selective memory. Tragedy, when it doesn't fit the national narrative, gets rewritten as inconvenience. And those left in the margins are often the ones whose stories most challenge the myth of royal invincibility. Because every dynasty has its shadows. And in those shadows are not just secrets, but people. Real, breathing individuals who carried royal names but were never allowed royal lives. And if you thought those were the only lives hidden in plain sight, wait until you learn what they've been quietly doing with the family archives. Because sometimes, the juiciest royal confessions are written not on a stage, but in a letter never meant to be opened.